everyone, welcome back to my channel and to another video. I'm Sally and this is Secret Life of a Seamstress. I hope you're all really well and you're having a good week. I thought I would start a new kind of mini series called My Top 5. So this would be kind of a short series of 4 or 5 videos based on my top 5 either hints or tips or my top 5 favourites of things, mainly things that I tend to get asked about over on Instagram or here on YouTube. Everything I talk about will be based on my own experience and what I've learned in my own sewing journey, and I hope it might be helpful to you if you are starting out in your own sewing journey or just in general, because I know that I get a lot of inspiration and help and hints and tips from other sewers out there on Instagram and in the YouTube community as well. So for my first video, I'm going to be sharing my top 5 hints and tips for choosing the right fabric to match to your chosen pattern or sewing project. So this is something that I'm really quite passionate about. I feel like when I finally got my head around the different types of fabric and how they worked and how they felt when you were wearing them and how they kind of paired to different patterns and things, I felt like that's really when I started to be able to grow in my own sewing journey. It's when I felt more confident in what I could make and how I could kind of recreate things and make things to kind of suit my own personal wardrobe. So I really hope that these 5 hints and tips will be helpful to you. So before I get started, as always, if you are new to my channel, I'd love you to consider subscribing. I post lots of sewing content mainly, with a little bit of knitting thrown in now and again too. So if you love knitting and sewing and creating, I'd love you to consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you do enjoy this video, I'd love you to give it a like and a comment below if you'd like to. And if you're interested in what I'm wearing today, I'm wearing quite an old make. This is a Sew Over It Eve dress, which I made quite a while ago now in a black floral viscose. I absolutely love this pattern. It's one of my favourites. It's a wrap dress. I've made it with a kind of 3/4 length sleeve, and it just kind of ties up around the waist. So on to my top 5 tips for choosing a fabric to match your chosen sewing pattern or sewing project. Tip number 1 would be to consult your pattern envelope. So this might seem like quite an obvious one, but hear me out. There's been many a time when I've bulldozed ahead and thought to myself, I really want to make this in such and such a fabric, and I haven't consulted the pattern envelope, only to realise that I've chosen completely the wrong fabric. So on the back of your pattern envelope, it will usually look something similar to this, and I'm just using my Tilly and the Buttons Lyra dress pattern here to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. Tilly and the Buttons patterns are really thorough and they're really pretty to look at as well, so I thought I'd show this one. So on the back of your pattern envelope, there'll always be a kind of fabric suggestions box there, and that is really helpful when you're choosing the correct kind of fabric to use for your project. So this one suggests a light to medium weight woven fabric, a cotton lawn, a voile, a seersucker, chambray, double gauze and viscose, or something kind of lightweight. And for this particular dress, that kind of lightweighty floatiness is just so that the gathers and the tiers of the dress will float really nicely and they'll feel nice when they're on. So suggesting a viscose or something drapey just gives that kind of flowy nature to the dress. If you were to use something stiffer like a cotton or something, then your frills and your sleeves would be much more structured, and the dress probably wouldn't feel quite so comfortable. So consulting your pattern envelope is always a good place to start. Now that's not to say, of course, that you can't deviate from your pattern suggestions. If you're feeling confident, then of course you can try out a different type of fabric. But I think you just need to be aware that your garment might not turn out quite like it looks like on the pattern image. But you might need to just make a couple of changes to the way that you sew the garment just to make sure that your garment fits correctly and that it hangs and feels the way you want it to when you're wearing it. Just to use an example recently in something that I made a Friday Pattern Company Davenport dress from a really floaty rayon fabric. And in the pattern suggestions, it does suggest something a little bit more structured than that, say like a linen or something. So if I just pop in a photo here, you can see that the flutter sleeves on the pattern image are a little bit more structured than the way that mine turned out. And that's just because I've used a more drapey kind of floaty fabric, so they tend to hang down a little bit rather than stick up the way that the pattern image shows that they should do. So in that case, I was very happy with my dress and I preferred that look, but it might be something that you need to consider. If you are looking for that kind of more structured look, you need to make sure that you are using the correct fabric to give that look. So that's tip number 1, always consult your pattern envelope. Tip number 2 would be to consider how you want to feel when you're wearing your finished garment. So this, of course, will probably be a personal preference. So for me personally, I don't like to feel too structured in anything. So if I'm ever making anything from a cotton, I'll tend to leave off the long sleeves or anything that causes me to not be able to bend or move my arms around properly, because I just don't feel comfortable like that. But I do love a cotton for, say, a shirt dress or a sleeveless shirt dress or something without sleeves. And of course, cotton gives that really lovely structured finish to a garment. So in this case, I would just say, think about your lifestyle, how you want to feel when the garment's finished. If you need to move it around a lot, if you've got small children, say, think about the kind of fabric that you want to be wearing. Do you want something floaty that will move with you, or that will feel really drapey and soft and comfortable? And just think about how you want to pair that with your sewing project. So of course, if you're going out to a party or to a wedding or something, then a structured dress is going to be perfect for that, because you're not going to have to do a lot of kind of playing on the floor with children, hopefully. Or, you know, you're going to be able to use that dress in its right situation. When I first started out on my sewing journey, I used to use a lot of cotton because that was one of the easiest fabrics to work with. And I know that a lot of people do that in the beginning of their sewing journey. But I quickly began to realise that cotton just didn't feel comfortable. As a top, really, I prefer something more drapey and more soft, something with a bit more movement. An example in my own makes is the Darling Ranges dress, which I mentioned many times, I know, but hear me out again. Darling Ranges dress does come as a kind of elbow length sleeve dress. But I just wouldn't be able to wear it in a chambray fabric as the pattern image suggests, because I just wouldn't feel comfortable in that. So whenever I've used a cotton or a chambray fabric, I've always cut the sleeves shorter, or I've taken the sleeves out completely, just because I don't feel comfortable with that kind of length of sleeve in that kind of fabric. And likewise in the winter, when I'm making sweatshirts and things like that, I tend to go for a fleece-backed fabric because I just feel more comfy and cosy in that kind of fabric. If I'm using, say, a French terry or a loop-back jersey, it just doesn't give that kind of cosy feel. And I've realised this winter that I'm just not reaching for my sweatshirts made in those kind of fabrics in the colder months. So I will be saving those loop-back jerseys and French terries for the warmer months in the spring and summer. We do live in the UK after all, so they'll definitely get some wear. But yeah, just think about if you're making something for the winter, perhaps you want to have that kind of cosy, fleecy feel inside rather than something that feels a bit cooler. As I say, all personal preference, but maybe just think about how you feel wearing things and how you want to feel wearing your finished garment. So that's tip number 2, think about how you want to feel when you're wearing your finished garment and choose your fabric accordingly. Tip number 3 is to look for the contrast in a pattern and fabric pairing. So for me, sometimes I think it's really fun to kind of use a fabric that you wouldn't necessarily be expecting to be used for that kind of pattern. So for example, if you're making a vintage inspired tea dress or a vintage inspired dress in general, you might think that it would be natural to go for a ditzy floral or something that's kind of vintage inspired. But sometimes I think it's quite fun to pair your fabric to your pattern or use a fabric that's kind of a bit out there, something that you wouldn't be expecting. For example, my recent Evelyn dress that I made for my Frugal Frocks challenge, I used the Evelyn dress from Simply Sewing magazine. It's a 1940s inspired dress, kind of shirt dress, and initially I really wanted to use a ditzy floral, but I had this gorgeous tiger print viscose in my stash, and I just thought after a little while that it would pair perfectly and it would just be something a little bit different. And I'm so pleased with how this dress turned out. And also with my recent Carolyn pyjamas, I had this beautiful sunglass print fabric from Minerva, which is kind of a bit loud and I wouldn't necessarily wear it out and about. I don't know why, but maybe it's a little bit too bright for me. But I thought it would make a beautiful pair of Carolyn pyjamas. The Carolyn pyjamas, again, kind of vintage inspired, and you wouldn't necessarily think about using a bright, kind of loud, out there print. I think it looks really great when people use a different kind of print to what you'd be expecting or what you traditionally want to use for that type of pattern. Likewise, of course, if you want to go down the more traditional route, think about the era that your pattern is from. So again, if your pattern is vintage inspired, then vintage prints would be like ditzy floral, Liberty inspired prints or something like that would be what you traditionally think to use with a vintage inspired pattern. Maybe polka dots or something would also be quite vintagey. And again, for the pyjama situation, you might traditionally use like a brushed cotton or a flannel or something like that. Maybe use a plain or a solid colour with a contrast binding. So sometimes it's quite nice to just do something a little bit different, and I think that works really well. Tip number 4 is to choose a fabric which pairs to your current skill set. So I can't tell you in the beginning of my sewing journey the amount of times that I was attracted to a fabric, not thinking about the type of fabric it was, and just going ahead and thinking I'd be able to sew something up with it, being completely disappointed and ending up in tears because I just wasn't ready to use that type of fabric. I'm thinking of a top that should have been made in a cotton, which I tried to use a really slippery crepe with. I just hadn't cut it out properly at all of the seams were mismatched. Just didn't work out at all, and I was really disappointed and put off of sewing for a while just because I kind of tried to run before I could walk. So if you are a beginner, or if you're not feeling quite confident enough yet in working with a slippery or more drapey fabric, it's probably a good idea to stick to something a bit more stable like cotton, or maybe a kind of stable linen or something like that, or a cotton blend fabric. Of course, if you are going to use cotton, it's important that you use a pattern that requires a cotton fabric as well, until you're feeling more confident enough to work with a more slippery or a drapey fabric. In my sewing journey, there was also the time where I tried to make a jersey dress out of something that should have been made with a cotton, which was also a disaster. So definitely choose something that's appropriate for your pattern, but also appropriate for your skill set. And it won't be long at all once you've got a couple of cotton makes under your belt before you feel confident enough to try a jersey or a viscose or something a bit more kind of difficult to work with. I'm just going to pop up an example of a cotton dress I made quite near to the beginning of my sewing journey when I was feeling a little bit more confident to try a more difficult pattern. I tried the Sew Over It vintage shirt dress in a lovely stable cotton fabric, sleeveless of course, but this was something that was a bit more difficult, something that kind of stretched my skill set. But because it was made from a cotton fabric, I didn't have the kind of drapiness and slippiness of a difficult fabric to work with, while I was learning a few more skills by making something that kind of tested my ability a bit more. So that's tip number 4, choose a fabric and a pattern that's appropriate for your current skill set. So my last tip, tip number 5, is to think about when and where you'll be wearing your finished garment. So say if you're making a lovely summer dress to wear in the warmer weather, you might want to consider using a more natural fabric like a viscose or a rayon or something that's really drapey, something that's a more natural fibre and quite breathable. And of course cotton and linen are really cool for the summertime too, rather than something that has a lot of polyester in it, which might become very kind of sweaty if you wear it in any kind of heat, or might stick to you, end up sticking to you. Polyester is a more man-made fibre, so it tends to be less breathable, and it tends to kind of give you that sweaty feeling and have it sticking to you within a few hours of wearing it in any kind of heat. So polyester might be more suitable for winter time, but again, you might want to think about how you'll be wearing your polyester garment, whether it will stick to your tights, whether you might want to line it so that you don't have that sticking to tights situation. Just think about the type of fabric you're going to be using and how you're going to be wearing it. I love to wear viscose and rayon fabrics because they're lovely and cool and floaty in the spring and summer. I also find that viscose and rayon feels nice and cool in the summer, but it actually feels quite warm in the winter. I don't know why that is, but yeah, it tends, because of the drape and the softness of it, it does feel quite comfy to wear in the winter time as well. It also might be worth thinking about the kind of commute that you're going to have when you're wearing your garments. So for example, if you're going to wear a lovely linen dress to a summer wedding, if you have a long car journey to get there, think about how much that fabric might crease in the heat. I think about how that fabric behaves, and think about how you're going to wear that garment when it's finished, and then choose your fabric appropriately. So those are my top 5 tips for choosing a fabric to match your sewing pattern or sewing project. I hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope you've enjoyed this different kind of video. As I say, these are all my own tips. There's nothing kind of technical or professional about them, they're just things that I've picked up and learned along the way. To be honest, I could have gone on and included a few more, but I thought I would just stick to 5 for now. Maybe I'll do another one in the future. But let me know what you think of this style of video, because I want to do this as a kind of mini series. If there is anything else that you'd like me to include in the top 5, or tips or hints or anything like that, please do let me know in the comments below or send me a message. I'd really like to hear from you as to what you think I should include in my upcoming videos. So that's all from me today. I'd love you to consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and don't forget to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!